Hey parents, so one of the things that I wanted to do was tell you a little bit more about the books that students are going to read over the course of the year. One, because I love talking about books, but also so that you have a little bit of context for what your child is going to be learning and doing in class, and maybe that can inspire some dinner table conversations when they come home and say, I'm reading The Glass Castle or I'm reading The Count of Monte Cristo. You should have kind of enough background. That's what I'm hoping to give you right now to ask them some questions about it and see what their experience has been like. At the outset, I want to say that not every student is going to love every book, and that is 100% okay. One of the goals of our curriculum is to expose students to lots of different kinds of books. So, classic books, contemporary books, fiction, nonfiction, realistic, fantastical, just to give them kind of a spread of everything that's possible in the world of literature. I think that sometimes we learn even more from books that we don't like than we do from the ones that we do enjoy. I know that that's definitely true for myself. It is my goal, though, for every student to love at least one of the books that we read. And a lot of times that's just a matter of personal preference. And some students will say that this book was the one that inspired them, and others will say that it was something totally different. Um, so we had summer reading. If that's a surprise to you or your child because you didn't get the letter, or you just moved into the district, or you didn't know that you were going to be attending Bellaire, that is okay. Talk with me, or better yet, have your child talk with me, and we will come up with a plan for how to address that. So, our first major book for the year is The Odyssey by Homer. I think that this is a really great place to start. You might have actually read this yourself in ninth grade. It is a very popular choice across the country for the first year in high school, and for good reason. So, if you're not familiar with The Odyssey, it is maybe the foundational text in Western civilization. It's certainly one of the oldest works, written about 3,000 years ago. It is the story of a soldier coming back from the Trojan War, trying to make his way home. And along the way, he encounters all sorts of obstacles before he is finally reunited with his family. So every other book that we read, and I might even argue that almost every other book in Western literature, is a variation of this plot. A hero goes on a journey, encounters obstacles, rises to meet some grand challenge in the end, and triumphs in some way after learning important lessons about the world and himself or herself. So it's a nice place to begin because it is the beginning of literature. But beyond that, I think that there are some nice metaphorical parallels to what students are going through in their own lives. High school is a kind of journey, and if you're 14 years old, it can sometimes seem to be a long and impossible journey. So I think that this book gives students some wisdom for how to get through that. I chose this version of the book to show to you because it's the graphic novel, and we will be reading some of this, but we will also be looking at the epic poem and some other variations and adaptations, all connected to the original text. So, the second book that we read, which will probably be starting in about October, is The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan. It is a book of, it's not quite a novel, it's a book of interconnected stories. And together, all of the stories woven together make up one big narrative. But about four mothers and four daughters, written by Chinese American author Amy Tan, published in 1989. It's a deep dive into the relationships between parents and their children, and because of that, I think that this is the book that elicits the strongest emotional response from students out of any that we read. Students sometimes struggle with the form. So after reading the Odyssey and this language that can seem a little bit archaic, the Joy Luck Club is much more conversational, easy to read, but the story goes back and forth in narrative time. 8 different main characters, 3 different timelines, the 1930s and 40s in China, then the 50s, 60s, and 70s in the United States, and then the 80s in both the US and China. So this is a book where the language is a lot more familiar and straightforward, but the structure is a little bit more complicated, which is a trend in contemporary fiction. A lot of the books today that are on noteworthy lists, Pulitzer winners, and that kind of thing, have this sort of approach. So this is a good way for students to become a little bit more familiar with that. Then we close out the fall semester with The Count of Monte Cristo. An important point that I want to mention at the beginning, we read a special edition of this. It is the abridged version. The unabridged version is 3 times as long and would take an entire semester to get through. So if you happen to be buying copies of the books for the entire school year, please get the one with the cover that looks like this. So The Count of Monte Cristo is such a juicy adventure story. The young man who becomes the Count of Monte Cristo is betrayed and wrongfully imprisoned, and he escapes from a dungeon in a really dramatic fashion after being imprisoned for a decade. And then he goes on this complicated, years-long quest for revenge against everyone who wronged him. There are pirates and poison and sword fighting, and people you think are dead come back to life. It was basically the soap opera of France in the 1800s. If you have heard of this book or read it, something that you might not know is that the author, Alexandre Dumas, was Black, and he was the descendant of Caribbean slaves and French aristocrats. And he wrote this at a time when slavery had only very recently been outlawed in France, was still legal in the United States. So one way of looking at the plot, which we examine, is as a metaphor for some of the prejudice and persecution that he and his family experienced in France at the time. And I think that this is a nice text because it is part of the Western canon. It is, quote, classic literature, but by looking at the biography of the author, it adds this very relevant dimension of richness and complexity and relevance to our study. And then we have the winter break, and when we come back in January, we start the spring semester with Dracula. Again, I want to point out that the text of the book should be the same across translations, but if you are picking up your own copy, I would really recommend this one, the Dover Thrift Edition, because that matches with the page numbers of some of the resources that we use, and it happens to be the least expensive. So we start Dracula deliberately in January because students have had a chance to kind of rest up over the winter break. Dracula is the most challenging book that we read. And so sometimes students will start out excited about reading a book about vampires, and then they're a little frustrated when the prose and the syntax are kind of complicated and challenging. But I think that it's an important experience because it helps them to become familiar with this style of writing so that they're ready for some other challenging classics in their later grade levels. And if you're going to read a Victorian Gothic novel, Dracula is pretty good. We could be reading Jane Eyre. It doesn't quite have the jazz of a vampire novel. So I think that ultimately this is one that students look back on and enjoy. So after we finish Dracula, we always pair that immediately with the hot zone because the science and the sociology of the spread of disease tell us a lot about why anyone would come up with myths and stories about vampires in the first place. And the students tend to think that that connection is pretty cool. So The Hot Zone is a work of nonfiction, not a novel length, but all true, written in the 1990s about Ebola. You might have heard of this recently. It's been in the news because National Geographic just did a mini series based on the book. Watched the first episode, looks pretty good. It's often really popular with the students, especially the kids who are excited about science. They get kind of an in-depth experience with a subject that they're passionate about. A former student who just graduated last year came back and told me that she was planning on majoring in public health and epidemiology in college, and that this book was part of what initially got her interested in that. Our primary focus with this unit is looking at rhetoric. So not just how we use language to entertain and how we tell stories, but how we can write to shape people's ideas and opinions about contemporary issues. So in addition to this text, we look at some political cartoons, some opinion pieces, and persuasive articles, and so on. Then in March or April, we read The Glass Castle. This is another really popular book. This is maybe the only book where I have to ask students to slow down and not read the entire thing the weekend that they get it. It's a memoir of growing up under a very challenging and unorthodox set of circumstances. And it's simultaneously shocking and horrifying, but also funny. So one that kids tend to enjoy a lot. And then finally, we close the year with Romeo and Juliet. This is actually an adaptation of Romeo and Juliet called Romeo and or Juliet that is a choose your own adventure kind of riff on the Shakespeare play. So I'm just showing you this because it has the best cover. I am willing to bet that you might have also read Romeo and Juliet in ninth grade. Again, across the country, a very popular choice for ninth grade curriculums. Um, Most students have never read a Shakespeare play before. I think this is a good place to begin. There are a couple of allusions to Romeo and Juliet in some of the other works that we read in Dracula and in The Count of Monte Cristo. I love Shakespeare and I'm excited to get to share that with students. I really try to make it fun and relevant. So we're reading parts of the play, but I try to incorporate some student performance, which students typically think is a lot of fun and pretty funny too. Um, I also believe really strongly that students need to watch performances of the play with actors who are really experts in the meaning of the language. And so we try to incorporate a couple of different films as well as some taped performances, one from the Globe Theatre in London. So that's how we close out the year.